And we are joined now by Leslie Kern, Professor of Geography and Environment at Mount Allison University in Canada, author of Gentrification is Inevitable and Other Lies. Leslie, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks for inviting me. Happy to be here.
Of course. So, your book details myths and lies about gentrification. And for our audience, what would be the biggest overall kind of big picture umbrella lie that you'd want them to come away with from listening to this interview?
Well, I think the clue is in the title, which is the idea that gentrification is inevitable, unstoppable, a kind of built-in feature of urban life. What I want people to come away with at the end of the book is the understanding that while gentrification is a powerful force and it's difficult to stop or even slow down, there are things that communities all over the world are doing and have done to take back some control of their environments and to push back against the forces of gentrification.
When you talk about that, I mean, what I'm reminded of, and we talk about this a lot on this program, is how conservatives naturalize injustice. And it's just when gentrification is treated as a process that is inevitable, as you say, it makes it just seem like, oh, tides go in, tides go out. You can't explain it, right? That there's no forces behind it. But we know, in particularly urban spaces, of course, real estate developers are driving that as well as business owners. It's capital. So, I mean, what are some of those major forces that you studied for your book that are making this not a natural process, but one that is obviously actively being fostered?
Yes, it's so true that there is an active process behind it. There are actual decision makers. There are actors who both facilitate the spread of gentrification and who actively pursue it and encourage it. I think in many cases we can look to local government and even higher levels of government for smoothing the spread of gentrification, if you will, clearing the path by removing any sorts of regulations that would slow it down. That might include things like rent stabilization or anti-eviction measures or control over the kinds of development and what developers need to kind of give back to the city in order to build their projects. So the city is, I think, an active agent in that way. And today, in the 2020s, the powerful forces that are propelling gentrification include large multinational corporations that see housing stock as an investment, as an asset class, and that are literally banking on the value of urban real estate increasing, oftentimes in a quick time frame, and so they are kind of actively pushing forward the kinds of changes to the urban environment that they believe will propel that price increase.
You touch on this, and I think it's just so key to understanding. And we had an interview recently about San Francisco, in particular on this front, but how developers are trying to change the role of urban spaces to a degree, not just, changing the complexion, raising rental prices for, for landlords doing so, or big, real estate interests, but also about creating urban spaces that are not just only livable for wealthier people, but that are playgrounds for people coming from outside the city. Can you talk about that dynamic?
Sure. So, one aspect of gentrification is a tourist-related gentrification, where the reality is that you can kind of charge tourists more to rent or to stay in a space than you can charge long-term residents. So we've seen kind of what some call the Airbnb-ification of cities, where a great deal of the once regular housing stock or long-term rental housing stock is being given over to short-term rentals, where the profit off of those goes sometimes to individual homeowners, but more often now we're seeing to kind of groups of investors and to corporations essentially that are buying up property and renting it out in this way. We could also think about those the playground for capital, if you will, where wealthy investors or speculators who may never set foot in the city own urban real estate, own residential spaces that sit empty. And this, I think, to many activists and to local residents is a real slap in the face when people are struggling to find housing and knowing that apartments are sitting empty and just accruing value for people who will literally never visit or live in them is just so shameful, I think, for us to witness.
Can you explain how that is unique to certain countries? Because there are protections against these kinds of things in other areas of the world.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And some countries, including Canada or certain cities in Canada where I live, have been kind of playing catch up and trying to apply different forms of taxation and limitations to disincentivize that kind of foreign ownership. But I think one of the places where we hear about that a lot is in the city of London, where the both the kind of the image of London and its reality as a global financial center mean that there's a great there's a cachet as well as a literal economic value to owning property in that city, and so many wealthy international investors own property there, again with the sole purpose of letting it accumulate value and kind of being able to say, oh, I have a London home, even though it's not really a home in the way that you and I would think about a home.
Right. Well, they become, I guess, hate places where people can almost store their wealth. We also had an interview about this a few months ago.
Yes.
This is kind of a bigger picture question. Is gentrification an inevitable condition, or is it? And I know it's not inevitable, as you say, but if the conditions of inequality are in existence, does that make gentrification inevitable? Do you know what I'm saying?
I think so. The way that I'm interpreting your question is this idea that if there are different kind of pockets, if you will, in an urban landscape where some areas have been disinvested and undervalued over time, then within a capitalist system, within a capitalist land market, I think gentrification is quite likely, right? In that you want to buy low and sell high. So some of those areas that were once seen as less desirable or kind of lower income, low priced become attractive for capital because there's the potential for that, relatively low level investment to rise in value over time. And it's the nature of capitalism that it always has to seek greater and greater profit margins. So in that context of that landscape of inequality, yes, the kind of the pull of capital into certain areas is very strong.
Can you trace the history of kind of the concept of gentrification, like in the United States in particular? I feel like in the 60s, you see this transition, this process beginning to happen, people leaving the cities, white flight, suburban centers, and sprawl kind of becoming an ideal, and there being an active disinvestment in the cities as well. So just historically, when you were looking at gentrification as a concept, where did it start and how did it kind of evolve over time?
The term itself was coined in 1964 in London by a sociologist, but of course the process had already been underway in different places for some time. And it was referring in that moment to what seemed like, given everything that you've just described, a very counterintuitive movement of middle class, often white house buyers into working class urban neighborhoods. And this seemed to go against everything that all of those trends that you just laid out. So the conversation at that point was very much around what was the kind of the cultural driver of this? What was attracting certain families, certain individuals to these areas. Now, I think it's clear that price was probably a factor, but there was also a kind of a countercultural movement, right, where some people wanted to reject the norms of suburbanization and kind of a conservative ideology and to do something different. Those who were living what would have been called alternative lifestyles at the time, whether they were single, whether they were part of the LGBTQ plus community, whether they were single parents, found more acceptance and a greater diversity in urban communities than they were finding in those white flight suburbs. So I think that cultural story is an important one to tell. It's not the whole story, but it certainly seems to have been a key part of the picture, particularly in those early years.
And then as maybe if you could take us even into like the 80s and the 90s and how the monster evolved.
The way that is described in the literature is kind of like a wave model that we in the early years had these, kind of a bohemian countercultural kind of left-wing artsy movement of people back into the city. But as the neighborhoods that they inhabited became a little more middle class, a little more palatable, if you will, to more mainstream families and households. There was the second wave is a kind of middle class household wave that starts to see these areas as a good investment and as having many of the amenities that they desire, whether those are, good schools, a nice green space, good access to public transportation, those sorts of things. And then the third wave, as we move kind of into the 90s and through to the present day, is this increasing involvement of those more powerful forces that we talked about at the beginning, the state kind of facilitating gentrification by removing or limiting regulatory controls, and the private development, finance, and real estate sectors getting very actively involved in new construction of homes in neighborhoods and tearing down public housing for market rate housing and all sorts of other investment strategies that have kind of capitalized on gentrification. Some call this an era of super gentrification, where it's like gentrification on top of gentrification.
Super gentrification. That is I mean, like, if that's super gentrification, then where are we at in 2022?
Yeah, I mean, it's this era where we see almost a real multiplicity of forms of gentrification. We've talked about like a tourism gentrification. We've talked about this kind of foreign speculation as a form of gentrification. We have a wide variety of forms that are, to my mind anyways, and as I argue in the book, ways of extracting value and wealth from urban neighborhoods, and often in the process taking them away from or displacing the people who were the ones who kind of made them what they were in the first place, but who are now not so able to enjoy, if you will, the fruits of their community labors over time.
Right. Well, Leslie Kern, I can't thank you enough. I really appreciate your time today. The book is called Gentrification is Inevitable and Other Lies. You can check that out. And thank you so much, Leslie. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you.